Russia has shamelessly violated the core tenets of the United Nations Charter. No more important than the clear prohibition against countries taking the territory of their neighbor by force.
Joe answer at the United Nations to a Vladimir Putin who hours earlier issued his strongest nuclear threat yet to the West. It's U.S.-led military support that's helped a determined Ukrainian army turn the tide on the battlefield and forced the Kremlin to call up 300,000 additional troops in a partial mobilization that Moscow's coupled with hastily organized referendums to annex Russian-controlled portions of Ukraine. How serious now is Putin? What does the Russian president mean when he warns the West that he's not bluffing? During the Cold War, both sides spoke what scholars call the language of deterrence, muscled messaging that made intentions clear so as to prevent nuclear war. How volatile is this moment in time? And does the West remember how to employ that language of deterrence? We'll be asking our panel about Biden's speech at the UN General Assembly 1 year after the U.S. seemed weakened by a messy pullout from Afghanistan. What's Washington's true might today? And what's its role when it comes to Russia, China, and its European allies? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Joe Biden's response to Vladimir Putin. Joining us from Washington, Stuart Patrick, Senior Fellow and Director at the Program on Global Governance at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much. I should change my ID. I just recently joined the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but neglected to mention that when you were booking. Booking me. Thank you.
Congratulations on the move, Stuart.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for being with us. With us as well, Nicolas Tenzel, non-resident senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. I got that right.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
Thanks for being with us. Samantha de Burden, associate fellow at the UK think tank Chatham House. Welcome back. And entrepreneur and commentator Andrei Lizakog-Petri, president of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative. How are you, sir?
Hello, François.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Before we delve into Joe Biden's response at the United Nations General Assembly, there was that speech originally scheduled for Tuesday evening, a 7-minute broadcast, which the first of one of its kind since the start of the war, and it came earlier in the day. Yinko Yatade has more.
It's nearly 7 months into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and President Vladimir Putin is ramping up the war effort. In a rare address to the nation, the Russian leader announced a partial military mobilization.
Only people in the military reserve will be drafted. The priority will be people who served in the armed forces, have military specialization and experience.
Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu says an initial 300,000 reservists will be called up, just a fraction of the 25 million potential fighters Shoigu says Moscow has at its disposal. According to the minister, the extra boots on the ground will not include students or conscripts who are currently serving their 1 year of mandatory military service. The announcement of the partial mobilization comes just a day after Russia's Duma passed a law that would toughen punishments for soldiers who desert the call to fight. The drafting represents a significant escalation of the war at a time when Moscow continues to suffer losses on the battlefield. Deflecting from his ailing military campaign, Putin, in his speech, accused the West of engaging in nuclear blackmail. In response, the leader says Russia is prepared to fight back.
I'd like to remind you that our country also has various weapons of destruction, and in certain aspects even more modern than NATO countries.
Putin's speech follows announcements by leaders in Russian-controlled regions in eastern and southern Ukraine that they will stage referendums that could pave the way for the formal annexation of these areas by Russia. It's plans Putin wholeheartedly supports, while Kyiv and the West have branded the vote a sham.
Nicolas Tenzer, 24 hours ago, when we first got wind of what Russia was preparing, we were expecting that speech on Tuesday evening, excuse me. We had one panelist say, well, this is a lot of bluster on the part of the Russians. Now that Vladimir Putin has spoken, what's your feeling?
Well, first of all, I mean, it was absolutely not an original speech because, I mean, when it comes, for instance, to uttering threats, and especially threats to the Western world, I mean, that's something that is said many times, since many years. I mean, that's absolutely not used. That's part of the narrative of the Kremlin that is quite often also spread by all his propagandists in the West, saying, well, if you take actions, then I will act decisively. So basically, this kind of speech has one and only one purpose, to deter the West. So basically, we must not buy this kind of speeches. Otherwise, it will show very bad examples also for other countries in the world. You know, China, regarding Taiwan, for instance, maybe Iran, maybe, Pakistan or North Korea. So, I mean, it will be very, very dangerous to buy this kind of things. I mean, the only things to do is basically to accelerate, to step in our effort to deter Russia, not the other way around.
Up the effort. Just a quick word on that, Samantha de Berden, before we hear some of those Western reactions. The speech, he doesn't really seem to target Ukraine as the enemy. It just seems to target the West.
Yes, he's very much targeting the West as the enemy. He basically even says that Ukraine is a victim of Western desires to use Ukraine as cannon fodder for the West's desire to get rid of Russia.
Why is he doing that?
Because he has to have an excuse. He can't tell his population that the second biggest army in the world was not able to defeat this country, which he has been basically scathingly criticizing for the last few years. He's been telling everybody that Ukraine doesn't exist, Ukraine doesn't have any national consciousness, so how can these Ukrainians who don't exist actually defend themselves? Russia's defeat in Ukraine can only be because the West is there actually fighting a war against Russia. So he has to use this excuse to justify the losses.
All right. At the rostrum of the United Nations earlier was the U.S. President, Joe Biden, who spoke hours earlier. Joe Biden, who way back in the 1970s as a U.S. Senator, worked on arms control with the Soviet Union.
This war is about extinguishing Ukraine's right to exist as a state, plain and simple, and Ukraine's right to exist as a people. Whoever you are, wherever you live, whatever you believe, that should make your blood run cold.
Now, Stuart Patrick, we heard, and again, this is a speech before the UN General Assembly. The audience is other world leaders. He didn't spell out any new specifics in reaction to Putin's speech, other than to say that he takes the nuclear threat seriously and that there'd be more sanctions. Should he have used tougher language?
Have made a strong statement along the lines of any use of weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons won't be met with a proportionate response. So he could have been stronger in that regard. I mean, it ups the ante a little bit. You know, it also would assume that Vladimir Putin is borrowing from Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon's madman theory of politics, where you pretend to be a madman as opposed to actually being one. I can't claim to know Vladimir Putin's state of mind as to which of those is actually accurate. I did feel like the president was masterful and actually exercised some perhaps uncharacteristic restraint in the way he described the threat that Vladimir Putin poses to the international system. He's often tried to frame this as a battle between autocracy and democracy. I think he very wisely, given the nature of his audience, which includes many countries that are skeptical of the democracy versus autocracy framing, but are very sensitive to the notion of sovereignty and non-intervention. And he really tried to paint Russia and the Russian leader as outliers and isolated within the international system. And if he wants to rally a large number of fence sitters around the world, I think that was a very savvy framing on his part.
Yeah, well, you got to wonder who rallied more fence sitters, Joe Biden with his words, or Vladimir Putin this morning. Again, Putin saying it's not even about Ukraine, effectively almost saying it's a war already with the West.
Well, I mean, it's really extraordinary the degree to which he's twisted everything around, right?
Let's take a listen to Vladimir Putin's exact words.
Sure. Okay. Mm-hmm.
They are no longer hiding the fact that Russia should be defeated by all means on the battlefield and then deprived of its political, economic, cultural, and in general any kind of sovereignty, with the complete plundering of our country. I want to remind those who allow themselves such statements about Russia that our country also has a variety of weapons of destruction, and in some cases even more modern than those in NATO countries. And if the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will without question use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff.
Stuart Patrick, what perhaps spooks many, and including those watching those words from Ukraine, is that sentence, "This is not a bluff."
Right, exactly. I mean, my view is that it is a bluff because Vladimir Putin is not suicidal, and he's had a lot of bluster earlier on. I think that provided that there aren't a large number of attacks, I mean, one could minimize the risk too by not having major attacks actually on the territory of Russia itself. But what he's doing here is consistently is he's twisting what actually is occurring to describe it as its entire opposite, so that it's Ukrainian sovereignty that's been violated. It's Ukrainian territorial integrity that's been violated. It's been Ukraine that has been threatened. And I think President Biden actually made those points quite clear. Nobody was threatening Russia. This was a war provoked by one man, and you see the sort of sham plebiscites, et cetera, that are being launched. There's no question that it ups the ante. These threats of escalation are highly serious, incredibly serious for the world's, one of the world's two largest nuclear armed powers. The notion that you would risk annihilation by really stepping over the nuclear threshold is not impossible, but I still think remains unlikely, provided that there's a significant signal of a Russian response.
You don't even have to launch nuclear weapons. On Monday, a missile fell 300 meters from the Pivden-Ukrainsk nuclear power plant, also known as the South Ukraine nuclear power plant. We can show you images from Volodymyr Zelensky's Telegram channel. Were the Russians aiming for the plant or a nearby hydroelectric dam? Either way, it's a chilling prospect to be staging conventional warfare in a nation that's home to 4 atomic power plants. André Lezekrug-Pietri, again, I hark back to this notion of the language of deterrence, because during the Cold War, there were codes. The rivals knew how to speak to each other. Do they know how to speak to each other in this circumstance?
Well, it seems what is very curious in this situation is that we have very little information of what really happens in the inner circle. And there's a lot of speculation about what's going on around Vladimir Putin. I would agree with Nicolas saying that basically the nuclear threat, as worrisome it is, has already been shaken in the last couple of weeks and months. What is new, and that might be an indication of what's really going on in Moscow, is this partial mobilization. That seems to, that's completely new. That's basically the main news in the speech of Putin, and that may indicate that they feel that they're losing the war in Ukraine, and they need to trigger something which they know will be socially dangerous even for the stability in Russia, because a complete mobilization would be obviously probably rejected. Yeah. So is there pressure mounting on Vladimir Putin? What is clear is that he's true to this old sentence that when you are in a hole, stop digging. He seems to be digging continuously and threatening the whole world with all us.
Well, let's put two things in perspective here, beginning with an initial reaction we noticed. We saw those images of a handful of protesters in Moscow, nonetheless braving the risk of arrest and going out into the streets a short while ago. And we also had this in the last 24 hours, a run on flights out of Moscow. as stocks plunged, the price of a ticket to Istanbul multiplied by 5 or 6 before selling out completely. Reuters journalist Felix Light tweeting that he checked out flights to destinations like Yerevan, Tashkent, Baku. They had sold out as well. Samantha de Mernon, are we making too much out of this? This is, of course, we're focusing on the liberal bubbles that are Moscow and St. Petersburg.
I actually don't think we're making too much out of this. And this is where Putin, I think, has taken a very big gamble. If you think of the Russian population and what opinion polls tell us, however untrustworthy they may be, one can assume that with the 80% who are in favour of the war, 20% would be against the war. Out of those 80% who are in favour of the war, according to opinion polls, you can then extrapolate that about 15 to 20% are the hawks who really want to go further, maybe want to use a weapon of mass destruction. Then you've got this 60% in the middle, who are the people who up until now have just wanted to pretend the war doesn't exist. And you see it on news channels, you see it in social media. I see it speaking to a lot of Russian friends, just they don't want to talk about it. We just have to think about something else. These people can now no longer ignore that something has happened.
Yeah, there was some poll that said that something like 48% of the Russians weren't even thinking about Ukraine.
They don't want to think about it. And if you think about, during the Afghan war, there was a very famous, some very famous interviews, and one person said, I don't want to know about this war because if I accept that this war is happening, I will have to take a stance. And the only stance I can take is to stop my boys from being killed. And that means being against the war. So this is the kind of thinking that we might actually see developing in Russia, where Russian mothers, Putin's biggest nightmare would be if Russian mothers get together with the Russian opposition. So
they were predicting that in 2014. It hasn't panned out the way it did when there was the war in Chechnya.
This is, 2014 was more Crimea. During the war in Chechnya, there were mothers who really mobilized and were complaining about the war in Chechnya. This is partial mobilization. And in spite of what Putin and Shoigu said, that this will only touch up to 300,000 people, if you actually read Putin's decree, it's a lot more vague than that. This could mean a lot larger mobilization than the 300,000. The decree itself, which is all that really counts, is deliberately vague. It even has paragraph 7 missing, which had a lot of people wondering about that.
Where's paragraph 7?
But this could be the beginning of something big. It might take a long time, and sadly, I think that the death throes, if this is the death throes of Putin's regime, could be very bloody indeed for everyone concerned.
Nicolas Tenzer, let's take Vladimir Putin at his word. Let's say it just is 300,000. I spoke with one Ukrainian watcher of all this. She reminded me that, when the war began in February, it was only 160,000 who crossed into Ukraine. So this is a huge number if it is true.
Yes, it is a huge number, but I think that's basically cannon fodder. Because most of those people are not trained. And basically, the Russian army has not the capability to train them efficiently. We see.
He says it's going to be just war veterans that are brought in.
Yes, exactly. Basically, I mean, it could be.
So they are soldiers.
They were trained. But probably they are not now able to fight. We don't know also the age of those people. Probably they are, 30, 40, 50, without any adequate trainings. They don't know why they will fight for. Basically, they are not convinced by Putin's arguments, obviously. I think basically it won't change. The dimensions of the war. It won't change, the fate of the war at the end of the day. It will certainly create some turmoil within the Russian society, even if there is a kind of dominant apathy, in the Russian society right now. And I think it will be very difficult for those people to mobilize, because many people now in Russia certainly oppose the war, but they oppose the war because basically they saw all, the defeats of the Russian army. They are not opposing the war because Putin has declared the war. Not because of the war crimes and the crimes against humanity committed against the Ukrainian people. They are absolutely not sensitive to this kind of issues. They are just looking away. And when it comes, to the changes in Russia itself, because I think that's the basic issues, even if it's a long-term issue. Basically, I think that Russia will be free when we will have on the Red Square memorials to the victims of Stalinism and a memorial to the victims of Putinism.
But it seems to be the opposite that we've seen over the last 20 years. We've seen Vladimir Putin tighten his grip on his country
Absolutely.
and prepare for a wartime economy.
Yes, but no, I mean, basically, we'll see with all the sanctions, because the sanctions are working. And I think that, the industry, military industry, and also many other industries are not able right now to deliver the products and to deliver the weapons, to repair the tanks, to repair the howitzers, in the Russian army.
Stuart Patrick, part of the fate of this war lies where you are right now, because it's definitely been a big push to a Ukrainian army that is certainly motivated, getting those weapons from the West, and starting with the United States. Just last week, they announced an extra billion. What's an extra $1 billion? I mean, it's a huge amount of money for us here in Europe, and yet right now, is there the resolve where you are to keep on with those weapons supplies?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that the question applies, of course, to the EU as well, and the UK, in terms of whether or not the resolve exists as this conflict drags on. I think there is now. I think there's a one of the few things that has enjoyed relatively strong bipartisan support, notwithstanding the approach of the midterm elections, where a lot of sort of Trump fans will be making the point that the United States shouldn't be involved in this. It doesn't have a dog in this fight. But I think for now, there seems to be solid support, and President Biden seemed to encourage that belief when he was speaking before the UN, as of course you might expect he would. I think one of the things we've been talking about, a lot of this being done for domestic political purposes, in a lot of Putin's move being done for domestic political purposes. But at this stage, particularly, facing losses on the battlefield, and, rushing to try to do these plebiscites or referenda to be able to suggest that the Donbass is quite happy to be going in Russia and some of the other annexed areas where they have these phony votes. I think there's an effort to try to hold on to as many of the gains as possible and have this become a frozen conflict, and as there are others on Russia's borders. But a lot of the success will, of course, depend on whether or not, with spiking energy prices in Europe, and sort of dwindling appetite for war, not just in the United States, but of course in Europe, there continues to be a solidarity with the Zelensky government, or rather sort of attempts to work around the Ukrainians to try to arrange some sort of a ceasefire or eventual peace agreement that would leave Vladimir Putin in control of some of his spoils, which I think many resist.
Well, you're in luck, Stuart, because we have a Franco-German in the room here. André Lezekiel-Pietri, it's that question of the resolve. We've asked it so many times, but we have to ask it again, especially on the day when Germany's nationalized one of its energy companies and announced a 29 billion euro bailout.
There was this famous picture in Der Spiegel, which is a pretty famous news magazine, where you had the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, which was displayed in a military fatigue, and it was called the olive greens. So the big surprise was...
She's a member of the Green Party.
She's a member of the Green Party. So I think actually the kind of comments that we heard out of Moscow will only strengthen the resolve. So if there was, again, a need for a shot in the arm in Paris, Berlin, or Marseille, I would say that. But just a few points on the military aspect. I think the 300,000 people is potential soldiers with training, okay, maybe older one. But the most important part is the equipment part. I mean, today, Russia is running out of equipment, of properly equipped soldiers, of properly training. I think the big surprise, and it's also a question for our own intelligence service, is that we totally overestimated the quality of the training.
But Putin's message is, the equipment doesn't always work. Yes, we use sometimes our soldiers as cannon fodder, but we're playing the long game.
Yes, but we see what is happening with Ukraine. Ukraine is managing to get a counteroffensive because suddenly they have training. And I must say on this part, kudos to the UK also, who trained, I think, up to 5,000 people so far. I don't see the same number of people trained in Ukraine by the French and the Germans. I think we need to do much more on that. I think we trained only dozens of people. So if you provide equipment, you also need to provide the human training with that. I think there the US is really doing its part. I was in Washington last week, and I can feel, I didn't hear any voice, even from some hardcore Trumpians, about the lack of support. I think this is truly bipartisan, as was said. And last but not least, I think what is truly dysfunctional in the Russian army is that you seem to lack actually what makes the strength of our Western armies is the famous sergeant. You have cannon food, you have the generals, some of them have been killed in action, but you don't have these intermediate
officers.
Sudden rank officers who actually make the whole machine, who make it agile, who are entrusted, and this is probably what will be the fate of the Russians.
If you listen to British radio in the morning, Samantha de Burden, it's now that the Queen's funeral is past, it's squarely about the cost of living. Again, do British people make that equation? That do they say to themselves, well, maybe we got to ease up a little bit on Russia here because these heating bills are going to be too much this winter?
Clearly, the equation is there, but I also think that the British people have in their DNA the memory of resisting a tyrant. They have in their DNA being alone in 1940, having our cities bombed, and I really don't think that the resolve will weaken. I think that anger will be directed against the government because the government is not taking the same measures that European governments are taking to cushion the blow of the fuel price rises. I personally, from what I'm seeing in the UK press, from what I'm hearing from people in the UK, I do not see the British resolve weakening in terms of support to Ukraine. And Liz Truss has actually carried on Boris Johnson's determination to continue supporting Ukraine.
And we're seeing perhaps some slight changes among other players. Before Putin's broadcast, the Turkish president in New York had been offering to play peacemaker, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who spoke Tuesday at the UN General Assembly. All the while, Erdogan, in an interview with U.S. broadcaster PBS, calling on the Russian president, who we met just last week at that regional summit on security in Uzbekistan, to hand back all invaded territories from Ukraine.
If a peace is going to be established in Ukraine, of course the returning of the land that was invaded will become really important. This is what is expected. This is what is wanted. Mr. Putin has taken certain steps. We have taken certain steps. The lands which were invaded will be returned to Ukraine. Since 2014, we have been talking to my dear friend Putin about this, and this is what we have requested from him. We asked him to return Crimea to its rightful owners.
He's saying, if you strike a peace deal, you got to give back Crimea.
Yes, I think
that's Ukraine's demand.
I mean that it's quite very important. From President Erdogan, I think, because basically that's the stance of all the world leaders, but not expressing this clearly. Because when the world leaders, including Emmanuel Macron, the French president, is talking about territorial integrity or sovereignty of Ukraine, basically it means that Russia has to return to Ukraine the old Donbass, the South regions, and Crimea. It cannot be part of the negotiations. And I think from this point of view, which is also, I think, very crucial, is to understand that, first of all, in those territories occupied by Russia, we are witnessing war crimes against humanity, like in Bucha, Izium, Borodyanka, Irpin, many other places. And for these reasons, we have also to free all the territories, including Crimea, because, for instance, when it comes to the Crimean Tatars, they are persecuted since 2014 by the Russian occupants. That's the first point. The second point is that you were talking about the risk, the kind of fatigue or lassitude vis-à-vis the war in the public opinion in the West. I think the more the war is lasting, the more we can fear this lassitude to gain the mind of many people in the West. So basically, when it comes to the delivery of weapons, which is the point that André was tackling just before, I think we have dramatically to step in. We have to deliver to Ukraine all the weapons it needs. I mean, without any kind of restrictions. It means tanks, it means fighter aircrafts, it means long-range missiles. And I mean, that's decisive. Time is of the essence here.
And that's been the message of Emmanuel Macron in New York, where he's also the French president.
Yeah, absolutely. His rhetoric has changed so much since the beginning of the war. He's now one of the most sort of firm and outspoken defenders of Ukrainian territorial integrity. But to go back on the idea of these self-determined republics may now have these referendums and be incorporated into Russia, I actually see a worrying change here, because these referendums are being speeded up. They were supposed to happen early September, then they were going to happen sometime late autumn. Now Putin, since his defeat a few weeks ago in Ukraine, is speeding up their integration into Russia. And this is where the nuclear card could be more worrying than it has been up till now, although I agree with Nicolas that this is something that Putin likes to threaten. He's saying it's not a bluff. Does that mean he was bluffing before? We don't know. But if these territories, which Ukraine considers to be Ukrainian and the whole international community recognizes as being Ukrainian, are attacked by Ukraine in order to regain them, Putin could then say, well, this is an attack against Russian territory, and this, according to Russian military doctrine, could potentially allow for the use of a nuclear response. So the fact that these referenda have been hurried in to make these republics part of Russian territory does make things slightly more worrying and more tense when it comes to the potential use of nuclear weapons.
Strong language by Vladimir Putin, it seems to have had a sort of an opposite effect on Beijing. Reacting to Putin's speech, China's foreign ministry calling for a ceasefire in Ukraine.
We always encourage the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries to be respected, and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be adhered to, and the legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously. China calls on relevant parties to properly resolve their differences through dialogue and consultation, and is willing to work with the international community to continue to play a constructive role in de-escalating the situation.
André Lozicouk-Pietri, this language, of course, follows that summit last week where Vladimir Putin had to acknowledge that Xi Jinping had questions for him.
No, absolutely. And we can see, I would draw a parallel with Erdogan's comments, where we can feel that these powers that were staying very carefully on the line, not to be, obviously not to support Russia in order to avoid any sanctions, especially for China, are now feeling that, as we say in French, the wind starts to blow in a different direction. And I think we can see, I mean, the fact that Erdogan is specifically mentioning Crimea as to be returned is also something relatively new, very explicit, and that China now is distancing and be very, very careful not to give any alibi or reason for especially the US to decrete more sanctions, because we saw in parallel that Biden is also much more outspoken on Taiwan. So these countries feel that their everlasting partnership with Russia is probably only a couple of weeks more to last.
And we heard at the outset of our conversation Stuart Patrick saying how this was a Biden showing a rare amount of restraint. Yep. He certainly seemed to be measuring his language when it came to China itself, when he spoke before the UN General Assembly. Let's listen.
Let me be direct about the competition between the United States and China. As we manage shifting geopolitical trends, the United States will conduct itself as a reasonable leader. We do not seek conflict. We do not seek a Cold War. We do not ask any nation to choose between the United States or any other partner.
Patrick, what was your reaction when you heard Joe Biden say that?
Yeah, I actually was highly pleased. I think that, there's a real danger, particularly in Washington these days, almost a unanimity within the foreign policy establishment that the United States is somehow headed towards a Cold War with China that will end up, in a sense, enveloping all spheres of of potential cooperation.
I mean,
And
he did
obviously-
call out Taiwan, and he did call out abuses in Xinjiang province.
Yeah, he did. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think he said, look, and he mentioned this with respect to Russia as well. He said, look, it's no secret that we believe that there's a contest between autocracy and democracy, and that and where the U.S. stands on that is pretty clear. But he also said, look, UN member states are not simply democracies. We wish they were, but they from the beginning they have not been. And so he at least laid out a possibility for a workmanlike relationship with the Chinese. He did reiterate, interestingly, the One China policy did not go nearly as far as he did in a news interview last weekend about the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan, adding a little bit more ambiguity, even more ambiguity to the policy of strategic ambiguity, since he's made a number of statements that are quite sort of forward-leaning, and only to have them walked back by some of his senior advisors. But I was heartened by what he said with respect to China. It's unsurprising that he would call out the Chinese government for Xinjiang, because he did have a section with respect to human rights, and also called out the Iranians, the Taliban, and many others. But generally speaking, I thought that the speech was really trying to isolate Russia. And this friendship, so-called friendship without limits between Russia and China, I think, has gotten a little frostier more recently, as the Chinese realize the degree to which, lashing themselves to a very unpredictable and mercurial leader like Vladimir Putin can create lots of headaches for them. I do think that that going forward, the question of the end game in Ukraine gets even more complicated, because you have a desperate Vladimir Putin who, of course, urgently wants to hold on to some of his gains. You have, as our other speakers have mentioned, the Turkish leader, et cetera, calling for the removal of all Russian forces from Ukraine. And then, of course, on the Ukrainian side, the notion that you could have some sort of negotiated settlement that would not have some accountability for the war crimes that have been committed, as well as, of course, all the return of the sovereign territory of Ukraine, is those prospects are quite minimal. So the notion even of an imposed agreement on Ukraine, I think, begins to seem quite illusory, and probably for a good thing.
Nicolas Tenzel.
Yes, I think certainly. I think President Biden is trying to widen the gap between China and Russia, and because the other countries in China and Russia right now, because basically, foreign policy is all about priorities and urgencies, and the urgency now is basically to deter Russia and to make Russia radically lose this war, because it will have very positive effects, on many countries. We see also all the Central Asian countries trying to distance themselves from Russia.
And India
we see
as well,
also with the Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict, basically Armenia perceive right now that Russia is not a trustworthy partner, and trying also probably not to join NATO, of course, but try to re-entrench, its own relationship with the visit of Nancy Pelosi, to Yerevan, with also the meeting between Tony Blinken and his counterparts of Armenia and Azerbaijan. And we have also some other concerns. In Europe, we have Hungary, we have also in the Balkans, we have Serbia. So basically, if Putin is losing radically this war, it will create a kind of, environment more propitious to peace, in the Balkans, in Europe, in Central Asia, in Africa as well. And I think we have to consider all the snowball positive effects of this defeat of Russia. And I think that to think strategically about that is that all the world leaders must have in mind.
Do you see the glass half full like Nicolas does, Samantha?
I see it in a much more positive view, in fact. If we think about Joe Biden's...
Because we started this conversation talking about the threat of nuclear war.
No, I think the threat is still there, but I'm thinking more long-term here, and I'm thinking on a strategic sort of international level. If we think of Joe Biden's softer language on China today, that could also be an acknowledgement of China's stance last week. Something really important happened last week. Before Xi Jinping went to Samarkand, to the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, he went to Kazakhstan. It was his first visit. And he said...
First visit abroad since the beginning of COVID.
First visit abroad since the beginning of COVID. He chose Kazakhstan to meet the Kazakh president. And he said If Kazakhstan's territorial integrity comes under threat, China will defend you. The only enemy that Kazakhstan potentially has is Russia, because Russia has designs on parts of northern Kazakhstan where you have millions of Russians living. This was incredibly strong language by Xi Jinping, directed not to the Kazakhs, but to the Russians. We will defend Kazakhstan against you.
And that thing about sovereignty was what we heard in that clip from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Andrei Luzik-Pietri.
No, absolutely. And it seems that we finally learned a lesson of this first vote at the UN, where we should never forget that more than 40 countries did not vote to condemn and this north-south or western rest of the world gap that we saw for the last 6 months finally is being trying to mend. And here also some support of the speech of Emmanuel Macron was also going into that same direction, saying we should not we should reinstitute some kind of a north-south partnership. That is what he wanted to say. And the way I see, we also see an incredible comeback of Joe Biden. I mean, remember, just 3 months ago, he was seen as, we all had this Sleepy Joe kind of stance by Donald Trump.
But by the way, it's not just Joe Biden, it's the United States. Because a year ago, UN Week was dominated by that messy pullout from Afghanistan by the United States. What's the U.S.'s stature today?
Well, first he struck. I mean, his military struck a coup with eliminating one of the heads of I think Al Qaeda just a month ago. So that saved a bit the face of this poor birthday anniversary of this 1 year of poor retreat of Afghanistan. Secondly, he got a lot of his internal bills also go, so he's again not anymore.
But I'm asking in the eyes of the rest of the world, how he's
and last but not least, I would a bit disagree, because I think the Nancy Pelosi trip to Taiwan can be seen in two ways. It was still this, maybe some would say, a Cold War mentality of kind of provoking. I mean, some people really wonder, was it a way of affirming the support of Taiwan, which is completely understandable? On the other side, it allowed the Chinese to make full-scale military exercise like they could never have done before. And interestingly, also last week in D.C., I heard the fact that increasingly more U.S. politicians don't say China is our competitor, but it's the Chinese Communist Party which is the real competitor. So he tries to avoid also the CPC playing the nationalist card that, by the way, Putin is playing so aggressively currently. So I think it's very interesting how the US is indeed coming back into this very relatively benevolent but heavyweight superpower.
Stuart Patrick, when you think of the tensions over Taiwan in relation to those nuclear-sized threats from Putin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously the folks in Beijing are looking very closely at the Ukraine lessons of Ukraine, and I think are probably, although obviously there was a lot of escalation during Nancy Pelosi's visit and its aftermath, but recognizing the difficulty, or the potential difficulty of actually taking a heavily armed island. Not necessarily impregnable, but heavily armed island in the case of Taiwan. Just picking up on some of the last comments, I do feel like, just in terms of the global impression of Joe Biden, I was very struck by his picking up of a theme that the Secretary General Antonio Guterres mentioned yesterday, which was the need for a more inclusive international order. Now, some of this may have been for show, because it would involve enormous hurdles. But he explicitly said that the United States was in favor of the enlargement of the UN Security Council in both its permanent members and its non-permanent members, and talked about the importance in Latin America, for instance, and sub-Saharan Africa of actually getting some greater representation on the Security Council. Again, the Gordian knot of all Gordian knots, but I was at least impressed by that. I was also impressed by the fact that he really went out of his way to talk about the need to deal with the debt burdens of developing countries, to help them combat climate change in a number of different ways, and then, of course, to address the lingering global health issues of the pandemic, as well as other types of global health threats.
Yeah, that promise of reforming the Security Council is one that our African viewers have heard before. Just very briefly before we go, Nicolas Tenzer, what do the French think Joe Biden's performance?
Well, I think it's basically what we have to witness, and also the French people and the French president is witnessing that, is basically that we need the US on board. I mean, on everything. In Ukraine, without, the US, Ukraine would have been destroyed.
Because we have a far right and a far left in parliament who
I'm
are
not
not
talking.
friends.
We have. Basically, the far right is pro-Putin. The far left. That's all tankies like you have, also in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn, with Die Linke in Germany. Basically, they are also basically backing Putin, Assad, and all the dictatorships on the planet. And then you have, the centrist party and Macron with this old, kind of appeasing tradition, as we have, in Germany as well. But basically, there was the idea that Europe could basically manage the things alone. That's basically untrue. Without the US, there is absolutely no solution, even if the US alone is not certainly able to deliver the solution.
A warming of transatlantic ties. We're out of time, but I want to ask you, Samantha Burton, because we've had that bilateral meeting between the U.S. president and the UK prime minister. We talk about the war in Ukraine, helping old allies to perhaps get along better. Does that mean he'll cut her more slack when it comes to Northern Ireland?
I don't think so. I don't think anyone will be cutting the British more slack when it comes to Northern Ireland, because what they're proposing goes against international law.
All right. Well, that'll be a word of warning for Liz Truss there from Samantha Burton. I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Nicolas Tenzer, André Lezecoq-Pietri,